Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight I've got 3 chilling true crime stories for you that are perfect for winding down, or if you're like me, for falling asleep to something dark and mysterious. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Alright, get comfortable. Let's jump into the first story. Fresh snow lay quiet along Lake Zoar when the ploughman saw it. Blue fibers, pale shards, and something that didn't belong on a riverbank. Human tissue, a tooth fragment, and a sliver of fingernail with pink polish. Who brings a wood chipper to a storm after midnight? Where is Helle Crafts, the Pan Am flight attendant who never missed a shift? And what kind of person tries erasure in a blizzard? The answer would come from microscopic evidence. Mail torn to an envelope with her name, kerf marks on bone, a chainsaw sunk in black water. To understand, we go back. Helle Nielsen Crafts grew up in Denmark, fluent in order and routine, drawn to the skies. As a Pan Am flight attendant, she was disciplined, punctual, and steady. In Newtown, Connecticut, those traits anchored a home. 3 children, a tidy schedule, neighbors who noticed how often she jogged the same route, how reliably she returned calls. She was dependable, almost to a fault. Richard Crafts was a different rhythm entirely. An airline pilot, a part-time police auxiliary, a man proud of training and gear. He collected guns, enjoyed the authority of a uniform, and kept financial details to himself. Aloof was the word friends used. He had presence, but little warmth. At the time, that combination read as competence. In hindsight, it reads as control. The marriage carried tension that wasn't loud but was constant. Travel schedules meant long separations, then collisions when routines clashed. The psychology of the moment is important. Power accumulates in small household decisions: who pays which bill, who keeps the checkbook, who decides what is need to know. He controlled the money. She managed the children. By 1986, whispers of infidelity surfaced. Helle didn't guess. She documented. She hired a private investigator during layovers, asking for proof because, in divorce court, proof matters. The investigator delivered photographs of Richard with another woman, ordinary images that detonated certainty. It destabilized the home, not with screaming, but with planning. She consulted a divorce attorney. She told friends she was leaving. She began quietly copying documents, preparing for a custody fight. She wasn't impulsive. She was methodical. Then came the threat line, reported later by friends. If you divorce me, you'll never see me again. People sometimes vent in anger, but investigators considered it a statement of intent when placed against what followed. Control threatened is often control reasserted, by any means available. November 1986 brought a brutal storm forecast, the kind that shutters roads and drowns sound in white noise. Helle returned from a flight tired, but alert. To colleagues, she confided a sentence that chills in retrospect. She felt unsafe at home. That wasn't melodrama. It was a measured assessment from someone who lived by checklists and contingency plans. Inside the house, signs gathered. The babysitter, who had seen the family in calm and chaos, noticed tension in the air. She later recalled unusual late-night noises, a missing portion of the master bedroom rug, and new bedding that didn't match the room's usual look. It wasn't a renovation season, and the rug's absence felt abrupt. She left with a prickle of unease that she couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, Richard's demeanor stayed even, almost rehearsed. He worked, he made calls, he moved through routines, but context matters. He had access to police scanners, an understanding of response times, and an operator's familiarity with equipment, trucks, trailers, heavy tools. In the same period, receipts would later show he rented a U-Haul and, unsettlingly, a commercial wood chipper. Who rents that during a blizzard? He did, and he insisted on using it. Friends expected Helle at work calls and school pickups. She didn't miss those. When she did, the silence wasn't gradual. It was immediate and absolute. No phone call to Pan Am, no messages to friends, no visit to the divorce attorney she'd scheduled. People who live by schedules don't vanish without a trace voluntarily. Here's where the contradiction sharpens. Richard began explaining her absence quickly, but the explanations shifted. She'd gone to Denmark, he said. Then Florida. Then she needed space. That's not a plan. That's a scramble. And yet, for all this, there was still no body, no clear scene, just a house that felt recently scrubbed, and a storm that seemed to have swallowed sound, time, and evidence. What stands out now in retrospect is that the storm that could have hidden everything also preserved it. Snow fixes timelines, it records tire tracks and freezes fluids. It pushes human behavior into the open. Anyone outside after midnight stands out. The babysitter's note about the missing rug, the new bedding, the late sounds, these become anchor points when stacked against weather logs, rental records, and a plough driver's route. Why would someone confident enough to wear a uniform, to carry a badge on weekends, think this would work? The psychology of the moment is important. He believed in planning and gear. He believed equipment could solve problems, that logistics could erase human reality. But there was one problem. People leave traces, even when reduced to fragments. Fibers cling. Male tears in ways that tie back to a kitchen counter. A fingernail with polish holds under snowpack in single-digit cold. Friends pressed police, refusing to accept absence as explanation. The private investigator arrived with photographs, notes, and Helle's recent warnings. The story shifted from a welfare check to a growing suspicion. The storm intensified outside, and inside a small Connecticut police department, a decision formed. Search not for a person avoiding home, but for a person who never left it alive. While that was happening in town, along the Housatonic River, a ploughman guided his truck through whiteout and noticed something unusual and unsettling. Lights, a truck, and the silhouette of a machine you do not expect to see, throwing chips into the night. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Calls taper off, appointments slip, friends make excuses. Here, it hit like a switch. Helle failed to report for a Pan Am assignment. Colleagues started dialing. She didn't miss call-ins. Her supervisor flagged it because her file showed punctuality, not turbulence. Friends tried the house, then the babysitter, then each other. The pattern was unusual and unsettling. No one had heard from her since the storm night. Richard answered some calls, not all. The first explanation sounded practiced. She'd gone to Denmark to see her mother. A day later, he changed it, saying Florida. She needed warmth and time. Then it was that she needed space. No destination offered. People who leave clean trails rarely scatter stories. The psychology of the moment is important. When control slips, narratives multiply, because one version won't cover all the questions. Police in Newtown approached cautiously. Domestic context, no body, no crime scene, a snowstorm that had washed out the calendar. That's a triad that usually ends in a delayed welfare check, not a homicide file. But friends arrived with specifics. The private investigator laid out photographs of Richard with another woman, a timeline of Helle's recent steps, the divorce consultation, the warnings to colleagues that she felt unsafe, the methodical copying of documents. They weren't dramatic, they were precise. It changed the tone in the room. Officers visited the Crafts' home. Richard was composed. He explained she'd left in a hurry, that she'd be back when she calmed down. Meanwhile, in the garage, and on paper, anomalies stacked up. Rental records noted a U-Haul, and on the storm's edge, a commercial wood chipper, an odd choice for a residential property buried in snow. Clerks remembered the insistence on taking it out despite the weather. It didn't fit a yardwork story, it fit urgency. And then there was the sighting. A town plough driver, working a graveyard route along the Housatonic River near Lake Zoar, remembered lights pinned in the whiteout, a truck, a man feeding branches or something into a chipper after midnight. He registered it as unusual, then kept clearing roads. At the time, he didn't know a Pan Am flight attendant had vanished, or that his route might become a timeline. What nobody knew at the time was that the storm preserved a record. Snow holds tire impressions, refreezing traps, debris, wind direction maps where light fragments land. Investigators started mapping calls, work rosters, weather logs. A welfare check widened into a missing person case, then leaned toward homicide suspicion when Helle's meticulous habits, children's schedules, flight rotations, attorney appointments just stopped. Richard's composure deepened into distance. He declined some interviews, allowed others, projected cooperation without substance. He told friends she'd made choices before without telling him. He mentioned Denmark again. Detectives called Helle's family. She hadn't arrived, hadn't called, hadn't booked a flight. Airline records showed no ticket under her name. Passports don't move in secret. That absence mattered. Inside the house, officers noted the recent removal of the master bedroom carpet and the chemical smell that clung to wood. They couldn't declare a crime based on a missing rug, but the detail lined up with the babysitter's late-night noises and new bedding. Luminol wasn't yet deployed. They needed a threshold of suspicion, The threshold arrived through persistence, friends refusing to let the files sit, the private investigators' documented fears, the plough driver's recollection, and the improbable wood chipper rental. The shift happened in a briefing room. A detective took a marker to a whiteboard and drew 3 columns. Behavior, timeline, physical anomalies. Under behavior, Richard's shifting explanations, cold effect, sudden disposal of household items. Timeline: storm night, midnight sighting, missed work call, no contact with the divorce attorney. Physical anomalies: missing carpet, chemical odor, wood chipper rental. The board didn't prove a murder, but it made another conclusion unlikely: voluntary disappearance. Meanwhile, a call from a Department of Transportation worker added a thread. He'd seen wood debris mixed with something soft near the river pull-off, like mulch that wasn't mulch. Storm crews logged it, then moved on. That note pulled attention to the shoreline where the plough driver had marked his turn. The decision followed: escalate. Investigators requested resources, dogs, divers if needed, evidence, technicians prepared for cold weather protocols. They didn't announce a homicide. They announced a search for tangible proof. It was a careful pivot. Without a body, corpus delicti becomes a hurdle later, so they built their case with fragments now. And here's where the story tips. The riverbank, silent under fresh snow, was about to speak, not in a confession, but in microscopic testimony. The welfare check had run its course. The investigation would now hinge on whether the elements that erase also reveal, and whether a winter storm could hold a life that someone tried to grind away. They built the search like a grid over silence. Before dawn, the staging area formed near Lake Zoar, cruisers idling, breath turning to vapor, evidence techs taping gloves over sleeves. The order of operations mattered. Dogs first, to trace volatile scents before diesel fumes and footprints contaminated the shoreline, then line searches, every step measured, flags marking anomalies in the snow. Stakes were immediate. If Helle had been reduced to fragments, each fragment carried weight: identity, trauma, timeline, miss one, and the narrative might never hold in court. Investigators considered the storm a paradox. It scattered debris but froze it in place. They mapped wind speed, direction, and the plough route as if reconstructing a crash. Action began with the dogs pulling toward the river pull-off where the plough driver remembered the truck and chipper. Within minutes, handlers called for bags. There, against browned grass under the surface crust, lay what looked like pale grit. Under magnification, grit became tissue. A tech whispered for tweezers. They bagged tiny pieces, soft tissue flecked with ice, a shard of bone no larger than a fingernail clipping. They marked coordinates, photographed angles, and moved inches at a time. Impact echoed across the line. The find meant the site was active, not imagined. They widened the grid. A blue fiber stood out against white. Another, and another. Blue that didn't belong to dead leaves or river trash. It matched the memory of a missing rug from the Crafts' home, and in hindsight, the fiber trail would matter. Meanwhile, something else was happening downstream. A second team, following the flow path, saw a sliver catching light, rose pink against white. It was a fragment of fingernail, with polish still visible. It was a human moment embedded in forensic work, a detail that could anchor identity if matched to photos, salon records, friends' recollections. They bagged it separately, each bag labeled with date, time, GPS point, initials, then the mail. A thin, torn corner of an envelope plastered to river ice, ink softened but legible in parts. A name, Helle's, emerging like a message. Not a full address, but enough to place household mail mixed into the debris field. Snow had covered it, then wind had shifted it, and the storm that hid everything briefly had also preserved this fragment. They dried it in a breathable container, no heat, to protect the ink. Forensic triage took over. A command post table filled with a hand-drawn map, pins for each recovery, strings indicating probable scatter from the chipper's discharge direction. They layered weather logs, gusts at 1:15 a.m., plough turn at 1:40 a.m., onto the map. The goal wasn't drama. It was sequencing. When did the fragments land relative to snowfall and refreeze? Divers entered black water, where the river widened. The psychology of the moment is important. Cold steals judgment, but protocol keeps people alive. They swept slowly, feeling for shapes that didn't belong. On the second pass, a diver's hand closed around metal with teeth. They winched up a steel chainsaw, Orange housing slick with silt, serial number plate filed smooth. Filing speaks to intent. Tex photographed, swabbed, sealed it in a rigid container. Back at the lab, acid would lift the ghost of the original number, a chemical reveal used when metal is stressed during stamping. Dental evidence surfaced next. Among bone granules, a crown fragment gleamed, ceramic, with trace adhesive. Odontology would later compare it to Helle's dental records, searching for morphology, unique dental work patterns. Identity can survive in enamel when everything else is torn apart. Hair and fibers told a parallel story. Several strands, consistent in color and length with Helle's known samples, lay embedded in ice crystals. Lab work would test mitochondrial DNA, while fibers went under comparison microscopy, matched against carpet remnants from the house and the blue fibers found at the river. The missing rug, removed from the bedroom, now echoed at the shoreline in microscopic threads. Impact gathered momentum. The riverbank had given enough to shift language, from missing person to probable homicide, but detectives stayed careful. They didn't name a weapon yet. They assembled parts. Tissue suggested dismemberment and disposal. Bone kerf marks, fine parallel striations, would later be compared to blade patterns from the recovered chainsaw. The fingernail with polish would humanize the evidence before a jury. The envelope fragment would tie the river to the Crafts household. Meanwhile, the plow driver returned to walk the site with investigators. He traced his tire tracks, pointed to where he'd paused, where the beam had caught the silhouette of the chipper spout. His timeline fit the weather data and the deposition pattern. It grounded the map with a human witness. Forensic patterning became narrative. The snow fell heaviest after midnight, which meant debris beneath the top layer predated the last burst. The angle of scatter aligned with the position of a truck backed toward the river. Chipper spout yawed right. The search team, now moving cautiously along the bank, found small flecks embedded in tree bark at waist height, consistent with high-velocity ejection from a chipper. The house would have to speak later, but here, the river gave back enough to argue that someone tried to erase a person and left physics to testify. Investigators boxed their evidence, logged every transfer, triple-checked seals. They knew what came next. Lab work, chain of custody, defense, and the slow, methodical assembly of a murder that someone tried to scatter into the night. While the river whispered in fragments, the house held the story's opening act. Detectives returned with a warrant and a plan, processed the Crafts' residence as if a violent event had occurred, even if the visible scene had been erased. Doors opened to cold air and the faint, unmistakable tang of chemical cleansers. The psychology of the moment is important. Heavy cleaning isn't proof, but in a home under divorce, pressure, and sudden absence, it becomes a signal. They started with luminol, the reagent that makes latent blood fluoresce in darkened rooms. Lights off, spray fine as mist, wait. A soft blue bloom traced along the master bedroom corridor, pooling faintly at a threshold, tapering toward the garage. Blood washed and diluted still reads to luminol, because iron in hemoglobin catalyzes the glow. It wasn't a cinematic flood, it was a faint map, enough to say fluid had moved through this space, and someone tried to scrub it from memory. On hands and knees, techs swabbed floorboards and baseboard seams. In the grain of wood, they found the stubborn ghost of bleach. Fresh paint around the lower wall edges looked too clean for a family with children. The master bedroom, normally anchored by a carpet, showed tacking strip scars, clean, recent, purposeful. The missing rug, which the babysitter had noted, wasn't a decorating choice. It was a removal, and in hindsight, a container that might have wrapped something no one was meant to see again. They documented bedding that looked new, receipts still in the trash, plastic packaging torn open, new sheets in a room where the mattress edge showed faint pilling from age, details that don't harmonize. They collected mattress swabs. Even after laundering, trace proteins cling. A lab would later call it human blood consistent with Helle's profile, but here, on that day, all they had was a pattern, clean over clean, too quickly layered. Freezers in the garage drew attention. One stood partially defrosted, stains along the lip diluted, like a spill wiped twice. Investigators considered the practical. In a storm that cuts power, freezers fail naturally. But neighbors hadn't lost power, and the timing aligned with the river timeline. Cold is a tool in staged disposal. It slows decomposition, stiffens tissue. The box's smear pattern, sampled and bagged, joined the chain. Purchase records told their own quiet tale. A U-Haul rental, the commercial wood chipper, and the chainsaw, bought months earlier under Richard's name. Receipts for contractor-grade trash bags, bleach, and towels clustered around the same window. The clerk who rented the chipper remembered his insistence on taking it into the storm, a detail that had felt unusual and unsettling even before the missing person report reached the counter. He recalled a line that stuck with him. He knew how to run it. He didn't need help, confidence, or urgency. Tool marks waited in the house for comparison. In the basement, a workbench held a blade file and solvent. The chainsaw in the river had its serial number filed off, but the blade pattern, the kerf geometry, can be as distinct as handwriting when it meets bone. Lab work would later align the microstriation patterns found on recovered bone shards to the type of blade that fit his steel. Not absolute identity, but consistent. And in a case built from consistencies, another brick. They canvassed drains and traps, bathroom P-traps, kitchen sink traps, laundry outlet filters. Hair caught there tells time. A few strands matched color and length to the ones recovered by the river. Mitochondrial DNA would do the rest. Detergent concentrations in the washing machine, higher than usual, suggested a deep clean cycle. The lint trap offered blue fibers, similar to those found on the riverbank, thread for thread, a dialogue between two scenes. Forensic patterning in the hallway suggested blunt trauma occurred near the bedroom doorframe. Not a large spatter, but microdroplets on lower wall paint under fresh coating, picked up with adhesive lifters. Impact spatter sits differently than transfer stains. It radiates in a constellation. That constellation told investigators someone had been struck, not cut by accident. It wasn't a fall, it was force. Unknown to them, across town, the medical examiner began building an autopsy without a body. Tissue fragments, bone shards, the tooth crown, the fingernail with pink polish. They became the anchors. Under microscopes, bone edges showed parallel kerf marks, consistent with a mechanical blade, not random breakage. Tissue showed cold artifact, cell structures altered by freezing, then maceration. The narrative formed: a night killing, containment in cold storage, dismemberment by saw, and disposal through a chipper aimed toward the riverbank snow, timed to a storm to hide sound and sight. Back at the house, the garage cement offered one more whisper. Under angled light, a faint, wiped pattern emerged, as if a heavy, soft object had been dragged toward the tailgate height of a vehicle. Cast-off arcs on a nearby pegboard hung at shoulder level, one arc preserved under a tool outline. Cleaning missed that shadow. It framed a moment, movement, not panic, but procedure. Prosecutors would later face the central problem. No intact body. Corpus delicti demands proof of a death by criminal act. Here, the house and the river, combined, argued that an erasure had been attempted and failed. The house had spoken in bleach, in fiber, in glow. The sequence was ready. Now they needed to turn fragments into a case a jury could hold. What happens when you need to prove a killing, and the body exists only as specks? For prosecutors, the legal hurdle had a Latin name, corpus delicti. They needed to establish two things: that Helle was dead, and that criminal agency caused it. No intact remains, no single fatal wound, just a mosaic of fragments. The psychology of the moment is important. Jurors want a face and a cause of death, but the science would have to stand in for both. They started by scaffolding experts like a bridge over uncertainty. Odontologists took the crown fragment, charted its contour, and compared it to Helle's dental records, margins, cusp anatomy, cement line. Not similar, but consistent at a level that narrows the world to one patient. Serologists reported human blood proteins on swabs from the mattress edge and hallway baseboard, consistent with Helle's profile. Toolmark analysts examined bone microstriation under comparison microscopes, aligning fine, parallel kerf marks with a chain-style cutting action, not a smooth rotary blade. Each expert answered a small question. Together, they addressed identity, injury, and method. Action moved through the timeline like a metronome. The plow driver's testimony set the clock. He saw a truck and chipper at the river pull-off after midnight, during the heaviest snow. He remembered the angle of the discharge spout, the silhouette of a man feeding material that didn't fall like branch wood. He didn't dramatize, he described. Weather logs matched his route and stop times. The map from the river search, pins and string, overlaid cleanly with his recollection. That anchored the disposal window. Impact deepened with the recovered chainsaw. At the lab, metallurgical etching, using acid to resurrect stressed metal beneath the filed surface, raised the serial number just enough to read. Records traced that number to a purchase by Richard. The blade type matched the kerf geometry seen on bone fragments. The chain's wear pattern, a subtle signature, was consistent with a saw that had bitten into hard material recently. Forensic convergence matters. Identity of tool, presence at scene, and marks on remains. Motive didn't stand alone. It braided into behavior. Financial records showed a pending divorce and the economic shock that would follow. Asset division, loss of control over money, and household decisions. Friends reported Helle's plan to leave, her custody preparation, her fear. Richard, in contrast, presented cold effect, a series of shifting explanations and a rapid disposal or replacement of household items, carpet gone, new bedding installed, a freezer recently defrosted despite stable neighborhood power. Jurors would have to decide, were these coincidences or choreography? The mail and the nail became the human anchors. That torn envelope corner, with Helle's name in softened ink, placed Crafts' household mail in the debris field. The fingernail fragment, with pink polish, linked the person to the place, not just paper to water. A microstory from a friend landed with quiet force. Helle liked that shade, wore it before flights, neat and consistent. It's not proof by itself, but it's a thread that ties identity to fragments in snow. Meanwhile, investigators tightened chain of custody, anticipating the defense. Every bag logged, every transfer signed. They photographed seals, documented freezer conditions, tracked storage temperatures. And yet, for all this, they had to anticipate contamination arguments. Snow melts, rivers move, scenes bleed into each other. The state's answer wasn't volume, it was sequence. What stands out now in retrospect is that sequencing beat speculation. Fragments under the storm's top layer predated the last snowfall burst, which the plow driver's timeline confirmed. This was the moment everything changed in the theory of the case. The medical examiner, synthesizing fragments, stated that dismemberment by saw and mechanical maceration through a chipper were evident. Not an accident, not self-harm. Mechanical patterns don't lie, and staging rarely accounts for toolmark specificity. The probability of all these elements aligning without criminal agency, prosecutors argued, was vanishingly small. The defense previewed its attack lines even before trial. Alternative explanations, animal activity, river debris, contamination from unrelated sources would be floated. But the recovered chainsaw, traced to Richard, sat like a weight on the other side of the scale. So did the woodchipper rental, the U-Haul, and the clerk's memory that he insisted on operating the machine despite a blizzard. Urgency and secrecy read through everyday transactions. Behavioral evidence added a final layer. When asked directly about Helle's whereabouts, Richard never initiated a missing person push, never organized a search, never called her airline colleagues. Instead, he cycled destinations, then drifted back to indifference. Investigators considered whether shock could explain it, but he knew police procedure, wore a uniform part-time, and understood the optics of concern. The absence of that performance, in hindsight, mattered. In the end, prosecutors didn't claim certainty about every minute. They offered a narrative built from physics, chemistry, and habit. Nighttime violence in the corridor, cold containment in a garage freezer, dismemberment by chainsaw, early morning disposal through a chipper aimed at a riverbank, time to a storm for cover. The storm tried to bury it. The storm preserved it. With that, the state filed charges. Certainty on paper doesn't guarantee consensus in a jury room, but the fragments were now a case. Court stripped the story down to parts, fibers, tool marks, timelines. The defense's plan was simple. Split every fragment from the next, argue contamination, and lean on the psychological barrier of convicting without a full body. Could a winter storm scramble evidence? Could river debris mix origins? They pressed those questions hard. Expert witnesses walked jurors through comparison microscopes and metallurgical etching, step by step. The odontologist matched the crown fragment's morphology to Helle's dental records. The toolmark analyst explained kerf striations consistent with a chain-driven blade, not random fracturing. The plow driver, calm and consistent, anchored the storm night sequence. And yet, for all this, the defense kept circling the same point. Fragments can mislead. But here's the twist. When the chainsaw's serial number reappeared under acid, traced to Richard's purchase, the defense pivoted. The saw was his, yes, but they suggested theft or prior loss. They emphasized the filed plate, as if someone else had done the filing. They raised hypothetical alternative sources for tissue, medical waste, animal predation, possibilities that sounded remote, but were designed to keep one door open. Reasonable doubt. Jurors wrestled with the absence at the heart of the case. Missing persons sometimes reappear. Bodies sometimes aren't found. The psychology of the moment is important. People hesitate to declare a person dead without the certainty of form. After weeks, the first jury deadlocked. A mistrial followed, and the woodchipper narrative moved from local fascination to national shorthand for a chilling mystery built from microscopic proof. The state recalibrated for the retrial. Not more evidence, clearer sequencing. Prosecutors tightened chain of custody exhibits, used cleaner visual aids, and presented the storm timeline as a single, unbroken strand. Rental receipts, weather logs, the plow driver's route, the deposition map from the riverbank, the house's luminol glow. They front-loaded identity anchors, the mail fragment with Helle's name, the fingernail with pink polish, so jurors could hold a person, not just artifacts. A micro-story from the first trial lingered. A juror later described how the fingernail evidence stuck with them in deliberations, a human detail that resisted abstract doubt. In the retrial, prosecutors leaned into that human scale. They avoided flourish. They let the tools speak. Kerf mark overlays appeared on screens, fine, parallel lines that matched the chain's geometry. The medical examiner explained, cold artifact in tissue, evidence of freezing before maceration. It painted a procedure, not chaos. Defense counsel returned to contamination and alternative theories, but the sequencing blunted the effect. The plow driver, again steady, reinforced the timeline. A clerk recalled Richard insisting on taking the chipper out in a blizzard. The airline records showed no ticket to Denmark, no movement. Friends recounted Helle's plans to leave, her fear, her meticulous habits. The absence of any voluntary trail grew heavier. This was the moment everything changed for the second jury. The convergence no longer felt like coincidence. The saw traced to him. The riverbank fragments sequenced within the storm window. The house glowed with wiped blood along a corridor to the garage. Control threatened, then control reasserted, in a way that left physics to testify. Verdict: guilty of murder. Sentencing followed. It became Connecticut's first no-body conviction, a precedent that said identity and criminal agency can be proven through fragments if the science holds and the sequence is clean. In the aftermath, the meaning wasn't spectacle. It was restraint, the quiet craft of forensic work meeting the psychology of control and winning. Now for the second story. Monitors pulsed softly when nurses found Ashley, unconscious, a vodka bottle tipped, and a typed confession left on the desk. It took credit for 2 deaths, detailed methods, named antifreeze, and read like a script. But whose voice was it? Odd phrasing, mechanical spacing, and one jarring word, anti-free. Deputies glanced at the printer, then the chair in front of Stacey Castor's computer. What stands out now in retrospect is that the note tried too hard. To understand why it existed at all, we need to go back to a flu that didn't break, a winter couch, and a death that passed as natural. At the end of 1999, Michael Wallace started to slow down. He worked a steady job in Syracuse, came home tired, and shrugged off aches as seasonal. He wasn't dramatic. He pushed through. The psychology of the moment is important. When a household runs on one person's steadiness and another's control, subtle illness gets narrated by whoever holds the calendar and the cash. Stacey kept the bills, the phone, and the story. Friends remembered her as organized, attentive, and insistent. The daughters, Ashley and Bree, lived inside their mother's instructions, homework, chores, bedtimes. Michael was the warmth, but lately he was on the couch more, drifting into sleep mid-show, waking to a glass offered from the kitchen. Symptoms came in waves: nausea, headache, back pain, then brief rallies that made it easy to believe a bug was clearing. In hindsight, that fluctuation fits a dosing pattern, small amounts across days, enough to mimic the flu. He saw a doctor once, got told to rest. Nobody ordered deeper labs. Why would they? It was midwinter. Everyone felt run down. There was one unusual and unsettling detail. His vision blurred. An eye exam noted crystals in the retina, but the finding didn't ring alarms in context. To a busy clinic, it looked incidental. Later, forensic pathologists would hear that note and stop cold. Calcium oxalate crystals form when ethylene glycol, antifreeze, metabolizes, binding into sharp structures that lodge in tissue. The body tries to flush them. The kidneys choke first. Meanwhile, life went on. Stacey organized holidays, watched the checkbook, and narrated Michael's decline to friends. "He's got the flu," she said. "He's stubborn," she added, as if refusal to rest explained the loop of sickness and slight recovery. The daughters wanted him up, wanted normal dinners and jokes, wanted their father who built things on weekends. Instead, they learned to accept the new tone of the house, quiet, controlled and ruled by fatigue. Michael's appetite dipped. Drinks mattered more. He sipped from cups brought to him, trusting the person who refilled the glass. Get this, neighbors later recalled Stacey mentioning antifreeze in conversation in a way that landed oddly, as if the word had been practiced. Investigators considered it a seed. At the time, it was a shrug line, a winter thought. As the year turned, his energy didn't. One evening close to Christmas, he settled on the couch, shivering under blankets in a warm room. He never woke. Paramedics arrived, worked a case that didn't present trauma, and handed it to a doctor who knew the family by paperwork. The death read as cardiac, or maybe complications of an undiagnosed condition. An autopsy wasn't ordered. Money was tight. Cremation was discussed, then delayed by cost. He was buried without answers. Without a trace of suspicion, the household reoriented. Stacey handled insurance and estate steps. The policy wasn't enormous, but it eased pressure. She told the girls their father had worked too hard. She told friends the flu had been worse than expected. Grief moved along a guided path. And yet, for all this, one friend couldn't forget the way Stacey said the word anti-free, clipped, rehearsed, detached from ordinary speech. The daughters adapted, because children do. Ashley watched her mother's precision, followed rules, and kept the peace. Bree was younger, folded into routines. The house looked stable from the street, lawn mowed, blinds even, birthdays remembered. Inside, the absence sat where the couch used to be busy with laughter. What nobody knew at the time was that the body kept a record. Even after burial, even after a winter of forgetting, tissues hold chemicals, crystals lock into place. The missed autopsy would matter later, because when another man died in another bedroom, the pattern would force a return to that first winter. Meanwhile, Stacey stepped into command, fully finances, decisions, narrative. People praised her strength. She accepted it. She kept saying anti-free when the topic of poisons came up, a word choice out of step with everyone else. The psychology of the moment is important. Control like scripts. Scripts don't tolerate loose ends. That couch death set the stage. Quietly, doctors signed, family mourned. No one scanned the kitchen for a viscous, sweet liquid hidden in a sports bottle, or a bottle tucked low in a garage, or a line rehearsed in a mirror. The girls didn't question a glass being urged into their father's hand. They didn't clock the taste as wrong. They were kids. Years later, Ashley would say some drinks seemed sweet, and that her mother told her to encourage Dad to hydrate. 3 years passed. New routines formed. The grief stabilized, then receded into stories. And then, in a different house with a new husband, a weekend fight, a locked door, and a green liquid in a glass would tear the first death out of its frame. The note on a hospital bed would try to rewrite 2 lives. But before the typed confession, there was this: a man who trusted, a winter illness that didn't heal, and a word that didn't belong. 3 years after Michael's funeral, Stacey remarried. David Castor, a small business owner outside Syracuse, brought assets, work ethic, and a desire for calm. Friends saw a couple that moved fast into routine. Prenup signed, Stacey handling accounts, David focusing on operations and the house. The psychology of the moment is important. She held the passwords, the schedules, the explanations. He trusted the person who said she had it under control. Late August 2005, a weekend argument simmered and then cooled into silence. Monday came without David at work. Stacey told staff he was sick, resting. By Tuesday, she phoned 911, voice clipped and efficient. She said David had locked himself in their bedroom after the fight, that he hadn't answered, that she feared he'd harmed himself. Deputies rolled out to a tidy ranch, blinds aligned, lawn trimmed, nothing chaotic from the curb. The bedroom door was locked from the inside. A deputy forced entry. The air carried a sharp, chemical tang. David lay on the bed, still. On the nightstand, a glass held a green liquid. On the floor nearby, a nearly empty jug of antifreeze. In the kitchen trash, wrapped in paper towels, a turkey baster. Action moved quickly. Paramedics confirmed death. Deputies secured the scene. Stacey stood in the hall, tears on command, speech measured. She repeated, "Anti-free," the same clipped phrasing, telling deputies he'd been depressed, that he might have chosen this after their argument. She said he'd sent her out of the room, locked the door, refused to talk. The word did, heavy lifting an easy narrative hook, a chemical most people know by smell and winter utility. Forensics started with the obvious. The glass on the nightstand bore David's DNA on the rim, but prints were sparse. The jug's neck showed smudges, not clear falls. The turkey baster, oddly out of place, carried David's DNA inside the bulb tip, as if liquid had been drawn and dispensed. Its external surfaces again lacked usable prints. By itself, that doesn't convict anyone. But in a bedroom where a man supposedly drank his own poison, a baster in the kitchen trash suggested delivery, not sipping. The medical examiner opened the body to a timeline. In the stomach, fluorescent green fluid, sweet odor, consistent with commercial antifreeze dyes. In the kidneys, calcium oxalate crystals, sharp and plentiful, a forensic signature of ethylene glycol metabolism. Toxicology would later chart blood levels consistent with dosing over hours to days, not a single catastrophic bolus. The body tells time, the crystals spell progression. Meanwhile, Stacey performed concern like a script. She took calls, asked about the investigation, emphasized how David had been so upset, how he drank anti-free, how he had access to the garage. Deputies noticed what wasn't there. A handwritten note in his voice, a pattern of prior threats, counseling records that pointed to self-harm. They also noticed what was there, a bed made around a body, surfaces wiped where prints would normally collect, a locked door, but a scene that felt arranged. What happened next remains shrouded in the friction between staging and science. The initial manner of death, pending toxicology, leaned towards suicide based on the locked door and presence of antifreeze. But the scene spoke in contradictions. The turkey baster in the trash suggested forced ingestion. The scarcity of prints where everyday handling should leave them suggested cleaning. The glass's neat placement felt curated. Deputies documented everything, sealed the baster, the glass, the jug, and photographed the ottoman, where a wet ring hinted an earlier resting spot for the green liquid. A micro-story from that day stuck with one investigator. Stacey mispronounced the compound again, anti-free, and did it consistently. People learn words through conversation. They tend to mirror common usage. Her insistence on that clipped form read as rehearsed. In hindsight, it would become a linguistic fingerprint, a detail that returned when a typed confession appeared with the same mistake. Impact settled in waves. David's death, at first, could be explained away in argument, a locked room, a toxic compound within reach. But the turkey baster complicated everything. Why would a man choosing suicide by antifreeze need a baster? Why was his DNA inside it, but with no clear prints on the outside? And why did Stacey's account lean so hard on a word she said the same unusual way, over and over? Detectives didn't have enough to charge. They had anomalies. So they waited on the lab, catalogued Stacey's statements, and kept an eye on finances. Insurance policies take time. Grief routines settle. Stacey moved efficiently, just as she had after Michael's death. She controlled the narrative, the estate, the calendar. And yet, for all this, the scene's strangeness persisted. But here's the twist. The medical examiner's report flagged dosing over time, inconsistent with a single, impulsive act. That, paired with the baster and the cleaned surfaces, tipped the file from tragedy towards suspicion. They didn't know yet that the first husband's grave still held answers. They only knew that a careful person might be using grief as cover, and that a single mispronounced word would echo louder than she intended. While deputies wrestled with the contradictions in David's locked bedroom, another file slid across a detective's desk. Michael Wallace, deceased 2000, flu-like illness, no autopsy. 2 men tied to the same woman, both with illness stories narrated by her, one now confirmed as ethylene glycol poisoning. What happens when a quiet winter death starts to look like a rehearsal? They pulled the burial records and called the medical examiner. Exhumation isn't routine. It's reserved for cases where pattern evidence suggests hidden violence. Here, the parallels were hard to ignore. Midwinter illness, a caregiver controlling access, and a consistent, unusual word choice that kept surfacing, anti-free. The petition went forward. A judge signed. Crews worked carefully, transferring Michael's remains to the lab under full chain of custody. The psychology of the moment is important. Families often resist exhumation because it reopens grief. But Ashley and Bree had started hearing rumors, the kind that stick because they explain what never sat right, the sweetness in a sports drink, the way their mother urged sips, the pace of decline that never matched a simple flu. They agreed to the process. They wanted answers their childhood hadn't allowed. At the lab, the medical examiner focused on what time preserves. Soft tissues degrade, but certain matrices, hair, bone, preserved organ samples retained from burial prep can hold chemical signatures. They sampled kidney tissue, examined slides under polarized light, and saw them, birefringent shards, calcium oxalate crystals, the same geometric shapes that had filled David's kidneys. Toxicology, using preserved specimens and bone marrow assays, detected ethylene glycol metabolites consistent with fatal exposure. It wasn't ambiguous. Michael's death, recorded as natural, was homicide by poisoning. Action shifted back through memory. Detectives re-interviewed friends and neighbors from 1999 and 2000. A pattern emerged. Stacey centralized caregiving, filtered information, and corrected people who asked about doctors. She told different versions of the same story, emphasizing that Michael was stubborn, that he wouldn't see a physician, that rest would fix it. Meanwhile, small details surfaced. A friend recalled a jug in the garage moved behind cleaning supplies. Another remembered Stacey's offhand line about how antifreeze could take care of things. Then that clipped anti-free again. At the time, it sounded like dark humor. In hindsight, it read as rehearsal. The daughter's recollections added weight without blame. Ashley described bringing her father Gatorade that tasted a little sweet but different, and being told by her mother to keep encouraging fluids. Bree remembered cups on the coffee table, condensation rings, and her father dozing through movies he used to quote, "Investigators were careful. Memory can be fragile, and suggestion can bend it." But their accounts matched the toxicology's timeline stepwise, dosing over days, symptom flares, brief rallies, organ failure, impact multiplied. With Michael's death reclassified as homicide, the David Castor case no longer stood alone. Two husbands, same household center, same compound, same narrator. Financial records showed that after Michael died, pressure eased, insurance proceeds stabilized the budget, debts reduced, control over assets increased. After David's death, similar steps unfolded: estate management, policy claims, rapid administrative action. Money wasn't the only motive, but it flowed along the edges of control. Detectives returned to Stacey's statements from the day David was found. She had volunteered the word anti-free before anyone had confirmed a cause. In missing person cases, silence is gradual. In staged suicide claims, specificity is too fast. The linguistic fingerprint mattered because it linked a voice to a method across years. They pulled digital footprints next. Even before the later typed note, logs showed Stacey researching poisoning mechanics around the time of David's decline, searches for ethylene glycol effects, detection windows, and whether antifreeze could be tasted when mixed. On older devices, artifacts were sparse, but remnants of queries lingered in server logs and ISP records. But here's the twist. The exhumation didn't just prove poisoning, it closed the gap in the narrative arc. Prosecutors now had a sequence: first husband poisoned quietly in winter, second husband poisoned with a staged, locked-room suicide. That sequence reframed the turkey baster, the wiped surfaces, the jug placement. It explained the confidence in the word she kept using. It set the stage for the moment a third, confession, would appear in a voice that wasn't hers to borrow. In the aftermath of the reclassification, charges began to cohere. They didn't move immediately. They built the bridge with more rivets, pharmacy purchases, store receipts for antifreeze brands with the same dye recovered in gastric contents, and statements from clerks who remembered winter purchases that didn't match a driving profile. The case now contained a chilling mystery without a trace of doubt about cause. And with that, attention turned back to the hospital room, the printer, and a daughter who had survived a script written to erase her. By summer 2007, the house ran on fragile truces. Ashley was starting college, pulling away, asking harder questions about David's death and Michael's. Rumors had reached her, whispers about antifreeze, about the turkey baster, about her mother's role. The psychology of the moment is important. Independence breaks choreography. Stacey felt the loss of control, and the arguments sharpened. Friends noticed the distance, the clipped exchanges, the way Ashley kept her phone close and her visits short. On a late August afternoon, Stacey invited Ashley home to talk it out. Texts from Ashley to a friend carried a hopeful tone she'd meet, listen, and head back to campus. Dinner passed without fireworks. Then came drinks. Stacey offered a mixture, something sweet to calm nerves, she said. Ashley texted one more time. "I think it'll be okay," then went quiet. 2 hours later, Stacey called 911 in a strained voice. She said she'd found Ashley in bed, unresponsive, an empty vodka bottle nearby, pill packets open. Paramedics arrived fast. In the room, a computer glowed on the desk. On the printer tray lay several pages, neatly stacked typed lines that read as confession. The heading invoked a daughter's voice. The content accepted blame for both men's deaths, described antifreeze explicitly, and apologized to a mother for the pain caused. The phrasing was stilted, the spacing mechanical, and there it was again, anti-free. Medics worked Ashley in the ambulance. Toxicology later showed sedatives and alcohol, but not in combinations consistent with a planned, knowledgeable overdose. The dosing suggested administration by another, not the scattered, high-variance grab typical of impulsive attempts. She stabilized, barely. In the ICU, monitors traced a jagged path back to consciousness. She had no memory of sitting down to type any confession. Her texts from that afternoon contradicted intent. Deputies sealed the room and collected the note. They photographed the screen, the keyboard, the printer tray, the chair's position relative to the desk. They pulled the computer for imaging. Forensic analysts moved methodically. Acquire a bit-by-bit copy. Preserve timestamps in UTC. Parse user accounts. And extract file metadata. The document's creation time lined up with a login under Stacey's user profile. Autosave artifacts in the temp directory showed keystrokes paced in a style consistent with an experienced typist. Steady intervals, minimal corrections. Ashley's dorm essays, pulled with consent later, showed a different cadence. Bursts, backspaces, pauses. What stood out in the text wasn't just that singular word. Phrases mirrored Stacey's prior statements to deputies, including the line that David had been so upset before locking the door, and a description of anti-free that matched how she spoke, not how Ashley wrote. Linguistic analysis, while not a perfect science, helped jurors hear cadence. Here, it helped detectives hear authorship. The note mentioned specifics only law enforcement, and Stacey had discussed details that hadn't been public. Printer forensics added another layer. Toner distribution patterns and a slight roller mark matched the printer in Stacey's office nook. A faint, unique streak left by a scuff on an internal drum appeared across the confession's pages, and a test page printed under warrant minutes later. The match was visual and convincing. In the system log, print jobs fired under Stacey's session within the window Ashley lay becoming unresponsive. Meanwhile, toxicology from Ashley's blood didn't show ethylene glycol, but sedatives at concentrations consistent with involuntary dosing. The pattern looked like a cocktail folded into a sweet drink. Nurses noted the smell on her breath, a mix of alcohol and something medicinal. The glass from Ashley's bedside, collected by techs, held residue that lab instruments later tied to a brand found in Stacey's cabinet. Again, not a smoking gun by itself, but part of a pattern. Controlled environment, controlled access, controlled story. A micro-story from that night cut through the data. A friend, waiting for Ashley to text that she'd reached back to campus, called repeatedly after midnight. The calls went unanswered. The friend sent a final message. "You good?" It remained unread until days later, opened in a hospital bed by a survivor who would say softly, "I didn't write that note." Stacey's demeanor tracked familiar lines concern framed in control. At the hospital, she hovered, preemptively told staff that Ashley had been distraught, that she'd confessed to terrible things, that the typed pages explained everything. She repeated, "anti-free," as if the word could anchor the narrative. But here's the twist. Detectives now had a triad: 2 confirmed poisonings by ethylene glycol in men connected to Stacey, and an attempted erasure of a living witness through sedatives and staged authorship. Digital analysts recovered deleted drafts on the computer fragments of the confession saved and erased, with metadata tying them to Stacey's account hours before the 911 call. Keystroke timing showed a steady, practiced flow. Autocorrect logs, when compared to Ashley's usual patterns, diverged. Ashley tended to misspell certain words consistently. The confession didn't reflect those idiosyncrasies. The psychology of the moment is important. People trying to mimic another voice often forget their own tell's word choice, rhythm, error types. Impact crystallized when Ashley, awake and careful, told detectives about the night, a drink she didn't finish, a wave of fatigue that felt unnatural, a memory frayed at the edges. She denied writing the note. She denied harming her father or David. She agreed to have her phone imaged, her laptop reviewed, her prior writings compared. The contrast was stark. The confession read like Stacey. The survivor sounded like herself. Arrest followed. Charges encompassed the attempted murder of Ashley, forgery, and, tethered to the earlier cases, the murder of David, and ultimately Michael. The note meant to close the book had opened it wide. Language, chemistry, and a printer's mechanical scar had turned a staged confession into a roadmap. And now, a daughter would live to contradict the script. To make sense of two dead husbands and a staged confession, investigators leaned on chemistry, language, and the small habits of machines. Ethylene glycol, antifreeze, is sweet and silent going down, but the metabolism is loud under a microscope. The liver converts it through a series of steps into acids that strip the body's balance, and finally into oxalate, which binds calcium and crystallizes. Those calcium oxalate crystals lodge in kidneys like ground glass. Under polarized light, they blaze. That blaze is the forensic signature. Not flu, not heart failure, but poison. The dosing timeline matters. A single bolus can kill, but it's obvious. Vomiting, deep intoxication, rapid acid buildup. Stepwise poisoning, small doses across hours or days, looks like winter illness. Nausea, back pain, fatigue, then brief rallies as the first dose clears enough for hope. In both Michael and David, toxicology patterns and organ findings fit stepwise dosing. That meant a caregiver's access, repeated opportunities, and a patient who trusted the hand with the glass. Scene analysis filled gaps the body couldn't speak. Suicide by drinking antifreeze leaves a trail. Containers handled, notes in the person's voice. Search history that shows contemplation. David's room had a glass, a jug, and a locked door, but almost no usable prints, and a turkey baster in the kitchen, trash with his DNA inside the tip. Investigators considered the baster a delivery tool, the way you'd push liquid into a mouth of someone too weak or resistant, or draw from a jug without lifting it into view. Its presence in the trash, not a garage or utility drawer, read like hurried staging. Use, wipe, discard. Linguistic forensics added an unusual anchor. The repeated misuse, anti-free, showed up in Stacey's speech, then reappeared in the typed confession attributed to Ashley. Analysts compared the note to Ashley's known writing emails, essays, text patterns, and found mismatches in rhythm, word choice, and error signature. Ashley paused and backspaced. The note flowed. Ashley used common phrasing. The note mirrored Stacey's prior statements to deputies. Language isn't DNA, but cadence is hard to counterfeit. Digital evidence hardened the authorship question. Forensic imaging pulled creation and modification timestamps straight from the file system, tied to Stacey's user account. Autosave fragments in the temp directory preserved earlier versions. A recovery journal showed keystroke intervals too steady for a novice typist. System logs recorded print jobs within the window Ashley was collapsing. A deleted draft named Note 2, Doc, left a ghost entry in the master file table, its hash recovered from unallocated space, matching text later printed. Investigators paired bits with toner. The confession pages bore a faint roller scar, a repeating diagonal streak at 3.2-inch intervals. A test print under warrant shared the same defect, unique to that unit's drumware. It's like a tire tread on paper. That mechanical fingerprint tied the words to the machine at Stacey's desk, while user logs tied the job to her session. Financial motive wasn't speculative. It was arithmetic. Insurance policies paid after Michael's death eased debts. David's estate, with business assets, promised stability. Control sat at the center, over money, over narrative, over access to bodies and drinks. Prosecutors didn't need a diagnosis. They needed behavior. They showed purchase records for antifreeze in off-pattern quantities, receipts for sedatives that appeared in Ashley's blood, and a calendar that placed Stacey alone with each victim during key windows. The psychology of the moment is important. Staging relies on what people expect to see. Winter sickness, a marital argument, a troubled daughter. Forensics looks for what staging misses. In David's case, a wiped nightstand still shed microswabs of human oils inconsistent with him alone. A bed made around a body suggested curation. A damp ring on an ottoman hinted at movement of the green glass before the final placement. And then there's time. Ethylene glycol's metabolites rise and fall predictably. Sedatives leave decay curves in serum. Analysts mapped those curves against phone logs, work records, and system activity. The result was a tight lattice. Dosing periods when Stacey was present, file edits on the confession when Ashley's messages stopped, and a 911 call calibrated to a script that put explanation in place before questions started. All of it would be tested in court. But in the lab, the story had already spoken chemistry on slides, language on pages, and staging that couldn't hide its seams. Court reduces lives to exhibits, but the strategy here was to put cadence and chemistry side by side. Prosecutors framed it simply: two husbands, the same compound, the same narrator, and then a daughter, nearly erased by a typed confession that spoke in her mother's voice. They opened with sequence, not spectacle: winter illness, oxalate crystals, the turkey baster, the printer scar, and those three syllables that kept returning: anti-free. The medical examiner took the stand first, calm, clinical. She explained calcium oxalate crystals glinting under polarized light, the kidney injury that follows ethylene glycol, and the dosing pattern that reads like flu until renal failure arrives. She didn't speculate on motive. She anchored time, hours to days, not minutes. The jury leaned in when she said it plainly. This wasn't a heart attack. This was poison. A toxicologist followed, mapping metabolism like train stops. Ethylene glycol to glycolic acid to oxalic acid, then binding calcium to form crystals. He'd seen accidental PET exposures, rare suicide cases, and deliberate poisoning. He pointed to levels in blood and vitreous humor, the eye fluid that holds time even when blood can't. Michael's preserved tissues matched. David's samples matched. Stepwise dosing, consistent with a caretaker's access. He let the chemistry speak. But here's the twist. The digital analyst turned pixels into behavior. He walked jurors through file system artifacts. Creation timestamps on the confession. Autosave shards. Print spool logs tied to Stacey's user account. He showed the repeating diagonal toner scar across the confession pages and the test print from Stacey's printer, same interval, same angle. He explained keystroke cadence steady, practiced and contrasted it with Ashley's dorm essays, which pulsed with pauses and backspaces. Language isn't math, but patterns are habits. Habits are hard to fake. Deputies filled the gaps with scene details. The turkey baster, found in the kitchen trash, tested with David's DNA inside. The odd absence of prints where daily life leaves them. A bed made tight around a body. A glass of green liquid moved, evidenced by a damp ring on an ottoman. One deputy recalled Stacey repeating anti-free unprompted, early and often. What stands out now, in retrospect, is that specificity arrived before questions did. The defense pressed back on every seam. They raised David's business stress, suggested depression, and argued the locked door proved intent. They floated contamination, could animal activity or rivering fluids explain crystals in Michael's exhumed tissue. The toxicologist answered directly. Calcium oxalate forms inside the body. It doesn't drift in from the environment. They implied the baster could have been used by David himself to avoid the taste. But why no prints? Why in the kitchen trash? They emphasized that language analysis isn't exact science. True, but the printer scar is mechanical, not interpretive. Then Ashley walked in. She sat straight, hands folded, voice steady. The psychology of the moment is important. A child who survived a hospital bed confession note is not a prop. She is a witness to her own erasure. She described the afternoon text to a friend about making peace, a sweet drink offered, a wave of fatigue she couldn't fight. She remembered flashes, then nothing until ICU lights. She denied writing the confession. She denied harming her father or David. She said the word antifreeze, the way most people do, and for a moment the courtroom heard the difference. On cross, defense counsel suggested she wrote the note in crisis, then tried to cover it up. They pulled her old messages, looked for dark posts, tried to stitch sadness into intent. She didn't break. She acknowledged normal struggles, college stress, grief, but suicide? No. And the documents? Not her cadence, not her spacing, not her word choice. When asked about anti-free, she blinked. I don't say it that way. Prosecutors returned to the baster, the jug, and the locked door. Why stage a lock if the scene tells the story? Because locks are theatre. Science reads around theatre. The medical examiner reiterated dosing over time. The locked door couldn't compress a multi-day curve into one night. The digital analyst reminded jurors that the confession printed while Ashley's phone went silent and Stacey's account was active. The timing wasn't just close, it overlapped. A micro-story landed with quiet force. A juror heard Ashley describe her dad on the couch, asking her to change the channel, smiling weakly, taking a sip from a cup she handed him because her mother told her to help. It reframed guilt. Investigators considered that moment crucial, not to blame a child, but to show how control moves through a house. One person pours, another trusts. The defense closed on doubt. No eyewitness, no video of dosing, no recording of authorship, therefore uncertainty. The state answered with convergence. Tool marks in bone, crystals in kidneys, a baster with DNA, a printer with a scar, a login with a clock, a word that didn't belong in a daughter's mouth. What sounded like separate notes formed a chord. Verdict. Guilty of murdering David Castor, attempted murder of Ashley, and forgery of the confession. Later proceedings tied Michael's homicide to the same pattern. In the aftermath, the room didn't cheer. People exhaled. Control had met chemistry, language, and a daughter who lived to testify. Sentencing arrived with the weight of 2 funerals and a hospital room. The judge read years that sounded like a life. The courtroom stayed still. Ashley spoke carefully, not to provoke, but to close a door. She severed ties with the person who'd written a script for her death. Bree stood with her. The psychology of the moment is important. Survivors don't get resolution, they get boundaries. In the aftermath, prosecutors stepped back and asked the question people always ask: why? They didn't present a diagnosis. They offered behavior. Control sat at the center, over money, over narrative, over who ate and drank what, and when. Financial records weren't dramatic, but they were steady. After Michael's death, insurance eased pressure. After David's, estates and assets shifted. It wasn't sudden wealth, it was stability on her terms. Investigators considered resentment as a secondary current, a partner who questioned her authority, a daughter who started asking her own questions. What stands out now in retrospect is that the motive didn't need grandeur, it needed proximity. Poison is a control crime. It allows caregiving and harm to occupy the same gesture, the hand offering a glass. In that overlap, people miss the line until it's too late. Nurses later recalled her hospital posture concern framed as management, steering conversations, preempting questions with that same oddly precise word. Anti-free became more than mispronunciation. It was a tell, a linguistic seam that split the staging open. System lessons followed. Michael's death was recorded as natural because it looked like winter illness in a man who worked hard and faded quietly. No autopsy meant no immediate challenge to the narrative. In hindsight, exhumation became the pivot that crimes like this often require. Pattern recognition is the tool. 2 deaths, same connection, same compound, same narrator. When the second case echoes the first, go back. The autopsy you didn't do becomes the autopsy you must do. Forensic practice evolved, too. Ethylene glycol leaves a signature, but only if someone looks. In Michael's case, the retinal crystal note was a missed thread. In David's, the turkey baster was the anomaly that wouldn't harmonize with suicide. Training began to emphasize scene contradictions over scene headlines. A locked door cannot compress a multi-day dosing curve. Staged grief that gets ahead of questions is a red flag. Absence of prints where life leaves them suggests wiping, not cleanliness. The cultural echo centered on language. Anti-free, 3 clipped syllables, moved from an oddity to a fingerprint. Linguistic evidence doesn't convict on its own, but here it guided attention to authorship. In the typed confession, cadence betrayed intent. Keystroke timing and printer scars translated that cadence into mechanical proof. It's an analogy investigators use now. A page can be as traceable as a tread pattern in mud if you know where to look. Victim focus returned the story to scale. Michael Wallace wasn't a plot point. He was a father who made ordinary days feel safe. David Castor wasn't a symbol. He was a husband who expected a weekend argument to end like most do, with a shrug and a repair. Ashley and Bree were teenagers, learning adult lessons too early, how trust can be exploited, how systems can miss, how persistence matters. Their resilience became part of the record, not as inspiration, but as fact. A daughter testified, clear and steady, under the shadow of a note that used her name to erase her. There's a caution in the aftermath that investigators carry forward. When grief looks tidy and narratives arrive fully formed, check the seams. When a caregiver controls access to food and drink, and illness follows a pattern of small doses and brief rallies. Consider a poisoning timeline. When a confession appears that ties every thread in a bow, ask whose voice you're hearing and which machine put ink on paper. The psychology of the moment is important because it explains method. Staging trades on expectation. Winter flu. Marital stress. A troubled student, these are common frames. Forensics strips frames and asks what the body, the scene, and the devices say when the script is removed. In this case, chemistry, language, and a single surviving witness turned a quiet narrative into a record that wouldn't bend. Unknown to them, across other jurisdictions, investigators reread old files where flu lasted too long, where a caregiver's story was the only story, where a word choice felt out of place. That's the larger meaning. Patterns hide in normalcy. The work is to make them visible before the next couch, the next bedroom, the next typed confession. Let's get to story number 3. The hymn didn't stop. Inside a silent Westfield mansion, an organ record looped while 5 bodies lay under sleeping bags in the ballroom, and upstairs a tidy apartment held a 6th room that wouldn't answer. Timers clicked lamps on and off, the thermostat sat low, and mail piled at the door. Where was John List? Why had no one seen the family for weeks? And how does a devout Lutheran father turn a house of prayer into a stage for erasure? To understand the prayers and the planning, we go back, before the hymn, before the empty house. On Sundays, John List looked like certainty. Dark suit, straight tie, Lutheran hymnal, open to the right page before the pastor spoke. In pews, appearances matter. In that world, reputation and salvation feel linked, like 2 columns holding the roof up. The psychology of the moment is important. In 1971, shame around debt and divorce ran deep in families like his, where doctrine set the tone and neighbors watched from close lawns. At the big house on Hillside Avenue, the arithmetic had stopped working months earlier. List, a trained accountant and former bank vice president, was unemployed. He didn't tell his family. He performed normal instead. Each morning, he straightened his tie, picked up his briefcase, kissed his wife Helen goodbye, and left for a commute that didn't exist. He sat at the train platform until the crowd thinned, then drifted to libraries and bus stations to kill hours. Get this, they actually thought he still had the job. He kept up the charade because image was oxygen. Money, meanwhile, slipped into arrears. The mortgage pressed in. Taxes stacked. He started siphoning from his mother, Alma's accounts. Small withdrawals first, then larger ones, to keep utilities from shutting off, to keep the facade intact. Alma, a devout woman in her 70s, lived on the 3rd floor in a neat apartment he'd built for her. She trusted him. She always had. Inside the marriage, pressure built around illness and alcohol. Helen had contracted syphilis years before, likely from her first husband, a fact that complicated her health and left her with neurological symptoms. She drank to manage pain and dread. She withdrew from the social life John expected a banker's wife to uphold. She told friends she wanted to move to a smaller house, to stop pretending. He refused. Downsizing would read as failure. The children were moving into their own orbits. Patricia loved drama and wanted to pursue theatre. John Jr. played soccer and followed rules, a steady son in a tightening household. Frederick, the youngest, absorbed the rhythms of a home where silence covered strain. The kids felt their father's rigidity, the way doctrine entered dinner as if it were a guest. Obedience, thrift, sin, salvation. Television in the living room spoke of a culture changing fast. John spoke of a world sliding toward ungodliness. That divergence mattered. He measured righteousness in predictable increments. Sunday attendance, tidy ledgers, the approved path. He feared humiliation, being seen without work, being known as a man who had lost control. A divorce, unthinkable. Their church condemned it. A public bankruptcy, a stain he couldn't bear. He clung to a belief that leadership meant control, and that control meant salvation, even if no one in the house felt saved. While the image held at church, at home the arithmetic stopped working. Notices arrived. He hid them. Calls came. He took them in another room. The house was grand but hollowing out. Rooms unused, bills deferred, a future mortgage to denial. He applied for jobs, got rejections, and filed them where no one would see. He told himself he was protecting his family from worry. In hindsight, he was protecting his own image from collapse. Helen's drinking sharpened their conflicts. She mocked his piety, he later wrote, and taunted him about his failures. Was that true in the exact words he claimed? We can't know. She wasn't there to answer. But neighbors recalled tension, curt voices, blinds that stayed closed, a social schedule that dwindled. Patricia confided to her drama teacher that she feared her father might do something bad. It sounded like teenage anxiety in the moment. In retrospect, it was a warning. His theology turned inward and hard. He studied Lutheran doctrine with the intensity of a man looking for permission. The world, he believed, was corrupting his children. If they fell away from church, from obedience, they might lose heaven. The idea formed like ice. A father could prevent that by intervening now. Not counseling, not therapy, something absolute. He would later write a 5-page letter to his pastor, quoting scripture and insisting he had saved their souls. That letter would explain what he did when he saw no earthly path that preserved reputation and salvation together. A micro-story fixes his state of mind. One weekday morning, he polished his shoes, set his briefcase on the front hall table, and paused at the framed family photo. Then he removed the picture, opened the frame, and carefully cut himself out. He did this to other photos too. It was a rehearsal for erasure. In that gesture, you can hear the plan beginning to speak. Why didn't he seek help? Pride, doctrine, and fear braided together. He'd survived war, served as a clerk in World War II and Korea, seen an orderly chain of command. The late 60s cultural shift, music, sex, protest, read to him as decay. He didn't adapt. He doubled down. He told himself leadership required sacrifice. He told himself a father could do a terrible thing for a higher good. He mistook control for care and logistics for mercy. By November of 1971, bills pressed, options narrowed, and the ritual of the false commute had worn thin. He built a calendar in his head. A day when the house would become a closed system, when phones would be answered with lies, when the organ would cover silence with hymns. The arithmetic hadn't improved. His theology had grown harsher. The stage was set, not for confession, but for a sequence he would later call salvation. He chose a weekday to disappear everyone. Routine would hide first moves, school bells would stagger returns, and the house would give him privacy between bells. The psychology of the moment is important. He wanted control over sequence, over noise, over who saw what and when. Dawn passed in a practiced rhythm. He packed lunches, spoke in a calm register, and kept his face ordinary. Patricia and Frederick left for school. John Jr. gathered his kit for soccer later. Helen stayed in her robe, a late breakfast ahead, the kitchen warm with coffee. He waited for the house to thin. In the kitchen, he stood behind her, a 9mm pistol, close, tilted down, one shot into the back of her head. No struggle, no warning. She collapsed forward, coffee bleeding into tile. He later wrote that he'd spared her suffering. What stands out now in retrospect is that the act was quiet, efficient, and rehearsed in his head for months. He walked up to the 3rd floor. Alma's apartment was tidy, curtains open to a cold morning. She loved him, trusted him, had entrusted her finances to him. He carried a .22 caliber revolver for her. He stepped into the doorway, spoke her name, and fired into her left eye. A direct, clinical shot, meant to finish instantly. He laid her down gently, covered her with a shawl, and left a note near her door about bank matters, practicality over grief. He moved back downstairs with towels and plastic sheeting. He dragged Helen's body to the ballroom, a grand room built for music and company, now repurposed for concealment. He arranged a sleeping bag as shroud, taped edges, and mopped the drag path. The thermostat clicked lower, the air thinned into cold. He needed time, not comfort. Midday, he called the school, told them the children wouldn't be in for a few days due to a family emergency in North Carolina. He called his employer, using the voice of a man still employed, and made similar noises about absence. He cancelled milk and newspapers, the small rhythms that announce life. Logistics stacked like bricks. Patricia arrived first in the afternoon, drama notes in her bag, wary from recent tension. He met her at the door, told her a small lie. A teacher needed to speak with her by phone, and guided her toward the kitchen. He shot her once behind the ear. She fell where her mother had fallen hours earlier. He wrapped her, carried her to the ballroom, and placed her beside Helen. He arranged a pillow under her head, a detail that reads as tenderness, but functions as staging. Frederick came home next, a younger boy, less suspicious. The pattern repeated: entry, reassurance, a single shot, a quiet fall. He, too, went to the ballroom, under a sleeping bag, lined head to toe with the others. He cleaned again. Bleach bit the air. The house muted sound. The timetable now hinged on the soccer field. John Jr. had a game after school. His father drove out as if the day were normal. On the sideline, parents gathered in coats, chatted about weather and grades. John stood apart, rigid, hands clasped, watched his son run drills. The psychology of the moment is important. He paused the killing to keep the timeline intact, so no one would come looking. They drove home together. Inside, the rhythm broke. John Jr. sensed something, or perhaps he saw a smear, not yet hidden, or smelled bleach where it didn't belong. He resisted. A struggle followed in the kitchen or the hall. Accounts differ on the precise spot, but neighbors later reported multiple shots echoing dull through the large rooms. He shot his son several times, finally in the face, to end movement. It took more bullets to subdue the child who fought back than all the others combined. He carried John Jr. to the ballroom. 4 bodies now lay in a row, mother and 3 children under sleeping bags that concealed faces, with feet aligned toward the organ. He brought down a rug to cover stains, then stopped, breathed, and began his next liturgy, staging. He set an organ record to play Lutheran hymns on repeat. He lowered the thermostat again. He set lamps on timers, rooms lighting and darkening through evenings to mimic presence. He wrote letters, one to his children's schools, one to his employer, and several to extended family explaining a sudden trip. Each note had a calm tone and a signature in his familiar hand. He ate a small meal at the kitchen counter, washed the dish, and put it away. He changed into clean clothes. He gathered the guns, wiped them, and placed them in a bag. He cut himself out of more photos, careful not to leave jagged edges that would draw the eye. He walked through each room, noticing what would look lived in and what would betray absence. Upstairs, he paused outside Alma's door, then returned downstairs to compose the longest letter to his pastor. 5 pages, typed and signed, explaining that he'd acted to save his family from spiritual ruin in a world gone wrong. He included instructions for hymns at their funerals, noted scriptural references, and suggested burial with simplicity. He asked for forgiveness, not from the state, but from God. He slept that night in the house. In the morning, he drove to the bank, to the post office, to the stationer's. He mailed the letters. He cancelled more services. He parked his car at JFK as a false trail. He walked away from the life he'd controlled into another that would be invented. In the ballroom, the hymn kept looping. Timers clicked. Cold, slowed decay. For weeks, neighbors believed life continued behind those walls, because light said so and sound carried across lawns. Inside, the bodies said nothing. The erasure had moved from violence to logistics, exactly as he'd planned. He'd turned slaughter into sequence. Now he turned absence into paperwork. The psychology of the moment is important. Silence doesn't hold on its own. It has to be managed. He started with doctrine, because doctrine explained everything in his mind. On carbon paper and onion skin copies, he typed a 5-page letter to his pastor. He quoted scripture, outlined a world sliding toward corruption, and framed the killings as mercy, arguing that he'd spared his family the risk of losing heaven. He listed hymns for a future service, named Bach and the Lutheran Chorale Book, and asked that the congregation pray. It wasn't apology, it was justification. Administrative cover came next. He called schools, calm and rehearsed, saying there'd been a sudden family emergency in North Carolina. He called the bank, where he'd once held a title, keeping his voice even as he posed as a man on leave. He cancelled milk and newspapers, those small deliveries that anchor a neighborhood's sense of time. A postal hold form stopped the daily clatter at the front door. He wrote notes to extended relatives, friendly but vague, mentioning travel, a visit, a change of plans. Money, the original pressure, became a harvest. He emptied checking and savings accounts to near zero, shifted what he could from Alma's funds, and tucked cash into a slim envelope. He visited a pawn counter with small items that wouldn't raise flags, such as an old watch and a set of silver pieces, converting family into bills. He drove to JFK, left his car in long-term parking as a decoy, then took trains back into anonymity. A false trail, planted to point detectives toward the idea of flight, not reinvention. In the house, he worked a second scene, cleaning not to erase everything but to dull edges. Bleach on tile, rugs repositioned, a runner dragged over high traffic marks. He cut himself out of photographs, leaving the remaining images intact, a family without a patriarch, preparing a future home where frames on a wall wouldn't betray him. He set the thermostat low, slowing odor and rot. He tested the lamp timers again, adjusting intervals so light would move from room to room like footsteps. The organ's loop covered the quiet with sacred noise. Meanwhile, something else was quietly in motion outside his plan. Patricia, days earlier, had told her drama teacher she feared her father would do something bad. The teacher, unsettled, had considered calling, then filed it under teenage dread. In hindsight, that sentence becomes an alarm bell that never rang. At the time, the house looked orderly from the curb, church attendance had stayed steady, and List's voice sounded reasonable on the phone. He posted the pastor's letter, sealing inside it the architecture of his theology. It laid out his belief that modern life had contaminated his household: drugs, sex, rebellious art, though there was no evidence his children were lost to those things. He wrote that he couldn't face the shame of divorce, that bankruptcy would scar the family's name, and that killing them now preserved their souls. He asked that his body, when found, be buried with them, as if the church could stitch a broken narrative into one solemn plot. He built redundancies into the cover. He told neighbors they might be away. He alerted employers with the North Carolina story. He forwarded a few pieces of mail, enough to muddy dates. He replaced a kitchen curtain he'd stained, bought with cash from a store where he wasn't known. He pre-signed a few checks that would later bounce, to stretch the illusion. He stacked church bulletins by the door, last week's on top, as if someone had just set them down. Inside that controlled theater, small failures began to tick. Milk delivery stopped, yes, but the smell, even slowed by cold, began to rise. A teacher noticed Patricia's absence stretching beyond a long weekend. A neighbor, walking a dog at dusk, saw lights blink the same way every night. Routine that's too perfect starts to feel mechanical, but the hymn, the timers, and the mail hold held for weeks, just long enough for him to disappear into rail stations and bus depots and, ultimately, another name. The psychology of the moment is important because it shows how logistics can buy time. He didn't vanish into romance, he vanished into errands, paperwork as camouflage, doctrine as excuse. A quiet mansion pretending to breathe, while 5 bodies lay aligned under sleeping bags in the ballroom. For a month, the house performed normal. The neighborhood believed the script. And then the smell pushed through hymn and timer, and the performance ended. The break didn't come from a clever trap. It came from biology. Weeks into the performance, the odor slipped past the thermostat and the hymn. Mail had stacked despite the hold. Packages sat untouched, and teachers' calls went unanswered. A neighbor, uneasy, flagged police for a welfare check. Officers arrived to a dark house that still blinked like a metronome. They knocked, then circled, then found a way in. Inside, the temperature bit. The organ record still looped, solemn and relentless. In the ballroom, flashlight beams caught the outlines, sleeping bags arranged in a row, edges taped, pillows under heads. One officer knelt, eased a zipper, and stopped speaking. Helen, then Patricia, then Frederick, then John Jr. 4 bodies, aligned toward the organ that had been asked to cover their silence. Upstairs, the 3rd-floor apartment sat tidy, curtains drawn back on winter light. In the bedroom, Alma lay where precision had placed her, a shawl across her shoulders, the single .22 caliber wound hidden by care. What stands out now in retrospect is how controlled the scene remained even in discovery. The thermostat sat low, lamp timers still clicking. Kitchen counters were wiped. Place settings from a halted meal waited on the table, a calendar frozen on November. This wasn't frenzy. It was housekeeping after carnage. Officers secured the house, called the medical examiner, and began the slow, methodical walk through List's logistics. They needed motive and sequence, but the suspect was gone. Paper would have to talk. In the study, a manila envelope lay on the desk, addressed to the pastor. Inside, 5 typed pages, signed in John's careful hand. He wrote of financial collapse, of the shame he could not bear, of the fear that his children would be lost to a corrupt age. He wrote in the cadence of doctrine, claiming mercy, insisting he had sent them to heaven while there was still time. He listed hymns for their service, asked for simple burials, and left notes on where to find accounts, where to contact relatives, and how to understand what he had done. He did not apologize to the law. He petitioned God. Forensics began to fix the timeline. 2 guns, a 9mm and a .22, recovered from absence rather than presence, were matched through ballistics to bullets recovered at autopsy. Power company records, paired with mechanical timers, mapped the illusion of occupancy, regular lamp intervals that had never varied, suggesting programming before departure. The thermostat setting, improbably low for a family of 6, explained the delay in odor. Mail logs and school attendance confirmed the first missed days. Phone records showed calls placed by List to schools and employers, his voice the bridge that carried the lie. A teacher, interviewed that night, repeated Patricia's warning from days earlier that her father was going to do something bad. At the time, it sounded like fear without detail. Now, it sat like a timestamp on dread. Neighbors described a man who had grown withdrawn, a house whose curtains closed earlier, a drip of milk bottles that stopped, then never resumed. The organ's loop, a sacred mask, had unsettled them without giving cause. Investigators catalogued the small staging choices. Photographs missing their patriarch, cut with care. Checks pre-signed and left in a drawer. A list in John's hand of funerary details, including the very hymns now echoing through the house. He had prepared clergy for theology, not police for evidence, but the letter to the pastor became both, a confession of intent and a blueprint of premeditation. Impact moved fast beyond Westfield. Reporters gathered at the perimeter. The boogeyman of Westfield became a headline, the mansion a symbol that suburban order could conceal annihilation. The house, already in arrears, would decay, then years later burn, but in that week, it stood as a stage, with its props still set. Timers, records, calendars, lists, while the actor had exited. But the killer wasn't in the house. He'd walked away before anyone asked the first question. The letter gave motive dressed as doctrine, shame wrapped as mercy. The scene gave sequence, cold and methodical. What remained was absence. A man without fingerprints in any national system, pre-digital trails thin and scattered. Theology had met discovery. The search for John List would now leave the mansion and enter years of empty rooms, new names, and a country that would forget his face until television forced it to remember. He didn't vanish into wilderness. He vanished into paperwork and habit. Within weeks, John List became Robert Bob Peter Clark, borrowing the name of a college acquaintance. The psychology of the moment is important. If you can pass the handshake and the Sunday bulletin, most communities won't ask for more. He moved first through cheap rooms and boarding houses, then west, where questions were fewer and resumes were thinner. Denver gave him air he could organize. He found an accounting job at a small firm that needed precision more than charm. References arrived by mail, typed, clipped, and unverifiable enough to be persuasive in a pre-digital era. Social security numbers weren't cross-checked nationally the way they are now. A borrowed identity could skate between local systems. He showed up early, balanced ledgers to the penny, and left at 5 for church. Co-workers noticed what he didn't bring: no stories, no family photos, no vacations. Just a man who ate the same lunch, wore the same grey suit, and kept his pencils sharpened to surgical points. Meanwhile, he rebuilt the same scaffolding that had held him before. He joined a Lutheran congregation, slid into the tenor section, and learned the rhythm of potlucks without learning anyone's secrets. He kept his answers short, tilted toward doctrine, and spoke of thrift as if it were a sacrament. He rented rooms where neighbors turned over quickly, paid cash when he could, and bought second-hand furniture that looked like it had belonged to someone older. The goal wasn't joy, it was invisibility. Then came Dolores. Church, as always, offered proximity without interrogation. She was orderly, devout, and drawn to steadiness after her own losses. He presented steadiness as a virtue, not a cover. They courted in quiet, married without fuss, and moved into a modest duplex where plastic runners protected carpet edges and a ledger book sat open on the kitchen table. Get this, he reused the same small economies: lights off in rooms that weren't occupied, receipts filed by month, canned goods rotated by expiration date. He didn't need to pretend. Routine is what he trusted. Across state lines, the case cooled into an urban legend. The Westfield mansion fell into disrepair, then years later burned. At anniversaries, reporters recycled the hymn and the sleeping bags, but leads thinned. The FBI had a wanted poster, a handful of dated photos, and no national fingerprint database that could talk to itself cleanly. Credit bureaus weren't networked. DMV systems were local fiefdoms. Agents chased men who looked a little like the banker from New Jersey, and every one of them turned out to be some other man trying to survive a different life. What stands out now, in retrospect, is how well piety sheltered him. In Denver, and later in Midlothian, Virginia, he was the man who volunteered for church finance committee, who never missed a pledge, who quoted the catechism by section and line. He had opinions about music, traditional hymns only, and about youth programming, more scripture, less modern influence. He didn't rant. He corrected, as if precision could save the world. He left gatherings early, citing work in the morning. He avoided cameras. When group photos were unavoidable, he drifted to the edge, half-profiled, a man who could be anyone's uncle and no one's friend. The FBI tried pattern analysis. Could a man with that voice, that cadence, that job history, show up in licensing boards or trade directories? Pre-digital records answered slowly and by mail. Agents sent letters, waited weeks, received stacks of paper, then found nothing they could act on. Without a live fingerprint, without a clear alias, the case lived in a file drawer, revisited when a new analyst wanted a puzzle. Families aged in the shadow of that empty drawer. Teachers who'd known Patricia retired. Neighbors moved away. The story hardened into a chilling mystery told at suburban dinner tables, how the house on Hillside had pretended to be alive while it wasn't. Meanwhile, the life he built recycled details. In one office, a co-worker recalled that he never made small talk but always balanced the office coffee fund without being asked. In another, a manager remembered that he wore earplugs during holiday parties, claiming headaches from loud music. He kept his keys on a belt clip, his budget in a notebook, his wardrobe in greys and browns. He favoured wire-rim glasses that narrowed his eyes. He asked about hymn choices on Sundays and objected gently when contemporary choruses crept in. The psychology of the moment is important. He found safety in the same liturgy that had once covered a ballroom. Dolores accepted the frugality. She praised his reliability, the way the bills were always paid, the way Sunday morning had a ritual. Shave, starch, salter. She didn't know about New Jersey. She didn't know about JFK, long-term parking, or a letter to a pastor that had once made seasoned detectives go still. She knew the man who scraped plates to save the dishwasher a cycle, who vacuumed in straight lines, who declined photographs because they never came out right. 18 years is a long time for a face to drift. The composite in the drawer stayed young while the man who had inspired it thickened at the jaw and hollowed at the cheeks. Investigators wondered, quietly was he dead under another name, buried by a small-town funeral home that filed no prints? Was he overseas, a clerk in Munich or Seoul, where his war postings had once put him? Or was he sitting in a pew, 2 states away, singing the same hymns he had set to cover the dead? Television would answer, but for nearly 2 decades, it didn't. Routine did. He survived by becoming the kind of man no one remembers clearly. Exact, undramatic, and wrapped in the respectability of church and numbers. The manhunt pressed against that fog and slid off. And while that was happening in offices and sanctuaries far from Westfield, the people who had loved Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick carried on under the weight of a name that had become a ghost. What finally cut through 18 years of fog wasn't a new database or a lucky fingerprint hit. It was a face rebuilt from memory and probability. In 1989, producers at America's Most Wanted pulled the Westfield file and asked a simple, unsettling question. What would John List look like now? The psychology of the moment is important. Aging distorts memory. Familiarity fades. To find him, they needed to give the country a new image to hold. They called forensic sculptor Frank Bender, a specialist in faces that time has moved. Bender studied the last photographs, the narrow jaw, the high forehead, the wire-rim glasses, and then added years as if he'd lived beside the man. He considered male-pattern baldness, how List's hairline would likely recede, how the cheeks would hollow and the jowls thicken. He added the kind of frames conservative men chose in the late 80s. He deepened the nasolabial folds, flattened the lips into a line that suggested restraint. He gave the bust a habit, not just a face. Meanwhile, agents provided life context to guide the clay. A man obsessed with thrift and routine would favor plain shirts, avoid fashion, and stick to wire rims. A Lutheran by reflex would likely remain near a congregation he trusted, perhaps in a smaller market where no one questioned gaps in a resume. Bender built those assumptions into the sculpture, as if they were ligaments. The broadcast did the rest. America's Most Wanted aired the segment to a weekend audience that spanned suburbs just like Westfield, and duplexes just like the one where List now balanced ledgers. The host walked viewers through the mansion, the hymn, the sleeping bags, and then turned to the bust, a grey-haired, wire-rimmed, tight-lipped man staring back. They paired it with a profile of the kind of spouse he might have chosen, orderly, conservative, church-going. They didn't know Dolores by name, but the silhouette fit. In Denver, a woman watched that face and thought of a neighbor in the next unit who never missed church. clipped coupons with surgical care, and introduced himself as Bob Clark. She looked again at the jawline, the glasses, the way the mouth held tension even at rest. Then she picked up the phone. "That's Bob Clark," she told the tip line. "He lives here." Tip lines fill with noise. This one carried weight because the sculpted face had given her something solid to measure against. Agents moved carefully. They built a quiet perimeter, pulled what records they could under the name Robert Peter Clark, and found a trail that didn't quite explain itself, references thin, history patchy, a social security number that belonged to someone else first. They recovered an old military fingerprint card for John Emil List and, through discreet maneuvering, obtained prints linked to Bob Clark from a prior employment file. Comparison removed doubt. Ridge endings and bifurcations lined up. The man in Richmond, where he'd recently moved with Delors, wasn't Bob. He was John. The arrest unfolded in a modest house that smelled of starch and lemon oil. Agents noted straightened towels, church bulletins stacked by month, and a budget ledger open on the table, columns squared. He denied at first, voice flat, a practiced calm. Who wouldn't? Names, after 18 years, cling like skin. But fingerprints don't negotiate. Confronted with the match, he conceded identity John Emil List while holding the line on motive. He spoke, even then, as if doctrine could buffer consequence. Dolores stood in the wreckage of a life she thought she knew. She had married Bob Clark, an accountant who sang hymns and left parties early. She hadn't married the man whose letter to a pastor once laid out the theology of a ballroom. The shock was clinical in its detail, his wire rims, his ledgers, his pew posture now recast as camouflage. Impact moved fast. The fugitive poster, once a young face, became a clay bust that the country recognized in a living room. Television had accomplished what paper couldn't. It updated a ghost. For investigators, the lesson was practical. When time erases a face, you might need to sculpt a new one. For the families, the lesson was heavier. Absence can end on an ordinary afternoon, in a house where the towels are aligned and the hymnals are current. Now the theology would meet the law. The man who'd set an organ to cover the dead would stand under fluorescent lights and hear charges. The hymn, finally, had to stop. Court brought the logistics into fluorescent light. John List, arrested as Bob Clark, now sat under his own name while prosecutors stacked sequence against scripture. The psychology of the moment is important. He didn't deny the killings. He framed them again as salvation. The state's task was to strip piety from premeditation and show a calendar, not a crisis. Prosecutors opened with the house as machine. The organ on loop, the thermostat set low, the lamps on timers, each device a lever that bought time. They walked jurors through the staged phone calls to schools and employers, the cancelled milk and newspapers, the letters mailed to carry the lie of a sudden trip. They projected the 5-page letter to the pastor, not for theology, but for forethought. A typed blueprint that anticipated discovery and attempted to control the narrative. This wasn't frenzy. It was planning. Ballistics experts testified to the 2 guns and their signatures. 9mm rounds recovered from Helen and John Jr., 22 caliber from Alma. Trajectory, stippling, wound location. The patterns spoke to execution-style shots at close range, not a chaotic brawl. The sequence mattered. Wife first, mother next. Children staggered by school bells. And finally, the eldest son after a soccer game. The gaps between killings, hours long, undercut any claim of sudden break. He had time to stop. He chose not to. Teachers and neighbors filled in the human edges. Patricia's drama teacher repeated the warning, "My father is going to do something bad," with the weight it had gained in hindsight. A neighbor described the mansion's lights blinking like clockwork for weeks. A postal supervisor explained the hold request that had stalled the front door clatter. Each voice reinforced the same point. The house performed a script after the killings, a script written by the man at the defense table. The defense countered with biography and belief. They put forward a psychiatrist to discuss wartime trauma. List had served as a clerk in World War II and Korea, the argument being that rigidity and anxiety had calcified into a disorder under financial strain. They spoke of his upbringing, strict, authoritarian, where sin was a ledger and shame a sentence. They suggested a delusional framework, he believed, sincerely, that he was saving souls from a corrupt age. Sincerity, they argued, shrinks culpability. But here's the twist. Sincerity doesn't erase sequence. The state returned, again and again, to time. The murders didn't occur in a single compressed episode. He set down one gun and picked up another. He made phone calls between killings, ate a meal, cleaned floors, rearranged rugs, wrote letters, programmed timers, and slept a night in the house, with 4 bodies aligned in the ballroom and 1 upstairs. Premeditation doesn't require a calendar on the wall, it shows up in the hours you use to stage. A forensic engineer testified about the timers and thermostat, plotting a graph that mapped evening lamp intervals and interior temperatures. The graph flattened into routine, proving programming before departure. A handwriting analyst authenticated the letters to schools, employers, and especially the Pastor John's signatures layered over known samples, pressure, and slant matching. The pastor, careful and grave, read portions of the 5-page confession into the record. It did what it had always done, exposed intent, cloaked as mercy. He had not begged for secular forgiveness, he had asserted theological right. Jurors heard from co-workers who knew him in Denver and Virginia as Bob Clark, the precise accountant, with church bulletins stacked by month. The prosecution used those witnesses not to punish reinvention, but to show continuity. The same obsession with order, the same avoidance of photographs, the same reliance on hymns and ledgers. The man who set an organ to loop in Westfield had chosen congregations as shelter for 18 years. Pattern is motive's shadow. The defense pressed the PTSD claim, argued diminished capacity, and suggested that rigid religiosity, fed by isolation and failure, had warped judgment beyond criminal intent. The state returned to the scene photos. Sleeping bags zipped, pillows placed, bodies aligned, a shawl arranged over Alma upstairs. Criminal intent can wear a tie and, quote, scripture. It can also tuck a pillow under a child's head and still be murder. The judge's charge drew a line the case needed. Moral belief, even sincerely held, does not constitute legal justification for homicide. The jury's task was not to weigh the theology in the letter. It was to measure the steps he took against the law. They retired with timelines and timers, with letters and lamp intervals, with ballistics and bank calls. They returned with the only verdict the sequence could bear: guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge called it meticulous, cold-blooded, language that matched the house more than any diagnosis. Sentencing stacked life terms, effectively erasing the rest of his days. In allocution, List spoke softly about heaven, about hope that his family had gotten there. He did not speak about the kitchen floor, the 3rd-floor apartment, or the soccer sideline. He did not apologize to the living whose lives he had bisected with a theology of control. Parole would be denied. Appeals would circle the same axis: capacity, belief, war scars, and fail against the weight of timers, thermostats, and the letter's calm prose. In prison, the hymn finally stopped. No organ, no lamps, no staged light moving across empty rooms. Only a ledger of choices, each entered on the day it was made, now balanced in a court that asked for sequence instead of salvation.